Good morning. Good morning. Karen Armstrong is a former Catholic nun who left the convent to study literature. A leading international authority on faiths, religious fundamentalism, and monotheism, Armstrong has written more than 20 books on faith and the major world religions. In 2008, she was awarded the TED Prize. TED stands for Technology, Entertainment, Design. It's a nonprofit devoted to what it calls ideas worth spreading. Armstrong won this prize in recognition and support of her call for a council of religious and spiritual leaders to draw up a charter of compassion that applies shared moral priorities to foster greater global understanding based on the principles of justice and respect. These spiritual leaders hail from all of the major world religions, including Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. The charter has been translated into more than 30 languages. You can find it yourself online at charterforcompassion.org, where you can also add your name to the list of the more than 85,000 people who have signed it, which include the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Here's the Charter for Compassion. The principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions, calling us always to treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves. Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures, to dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another there, and to honor the inviolable sanctity of every single human being, treating everybody, without exception, with absolute justice, equity, and respect. It is also necessary in both public and private life to refrain consistently and empathically from inflicting pain, to act or speak violently out of spite, chauvinism, or self-interest, to impoverish, exploit, or deny basic human rights to anyone, and to incite hatred by denigrating others, even our enemies, is a denial of our common humanity. We acknowledge that we have failed to live compassionately, and that some even have increased the sum of human misery in the name of religion. We therefore call upon all men and women to restore compassion to the center of morality and religion, to return to the ancient principle that any interpretation of Scripture that breeds violence, hatred, or disdain is illegitimate, to ensure that youth are given accurate and respectful information about other traditions, religions, and cultures, to encourage a positive appreciation of cultural and religious diversity, to cultivate an informed empathy with the suffering of all human beings, even those regarded as enemies. We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world, rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness. Compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries. Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential to human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity. It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable to the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community. In spite of our springing forward this morning by 1 hour. Today's service marks the first in a series of reflections on compassion in the world's religions. I thought we would begin the series by talking about compassion vis-a-vis Unitarian Universalism. In the months of April to August, we will welcome to our pulpit leaders from Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, Wicca, and humanism to speak about the role of compassion in their respective religious or ethical traditions. And as much as I would like to take credit for this idea, alas, I cannot. This series is modeled after a similar one hosted last year by the Cathedral Folk in the Mid-Cities. A good friend of mine who is a member of that congregation invited me to attend. And before I imitated the series here, I did, of course, ask the organizer of the Cathedral Folks if he would mind me essentially copying the series during Russell's sabbatical period. He said he did not mind at all. Of course, it might have helped that I got our minister, Russell, to eventually be one of the presenters at their series. I don't know about you, but when I first read the Charter for Compassion, the one I just read a few minutes ago, it reminded me a great deal of our own 7 principles. Both the Charter and our principles speak to the need to treat all people with respect. Both the Charter and our principles speak of how our interdependence calls for us to act compassionately so that we can foster peace and justice in the world. The Charter also emphasizes the need to learn about and understand the role that compassion plays in other religions. Likewise, as Unitarian Universalists, we state formally that the living tradition we share draws from many sources, including wisdom from the world's religions, which inspires us in our ethical and spiritual life. In noting these similarities between the Charter for Compassion and our own Unitarian Universalist ideals, you might be tempted to think that we Unitarian Universalists have got this whole compassion thing covered. But the truth is that while beautiful in their simplicity and clarity, both the Charter for Compassion and our principles are a tall order to fill. As we all know, it is significantly easier to say you believe something than to actually live your life in a way that reflects that belief. As Karen Armstrong says, religion is not about believing things. It's ethical alchemy. It's about behaving in a way that changes you, that gives you intimations of holiness and sacredness. So how do we go about living our ideals of compassion? In her 2010 book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, Karen Armstrong gives practical steps for nurturing compassionate thought, speech, and action. A title with the word 12 steps probably conjures up the 12 steps of the Alcoholics Anonymous program. And this mental association is actually intentional on Armstrong's part. She says, "We are addicted to our egotism. We cannot think how we would manage without our pet hatreds and prejudices that give us such a buzz of righteousness. Like addicts, we have come to depend on the instant rush of energy and delight we feel when we display our cleverness by making an unkind remark and the spurt of triumph when we vanquish an annoying colleague. Thus do we assert ourselves and tell the world who we are. It is difficult to break a habit upon which we depend for our sense of self. As in AA, the disciplines learned at each step have to become part of your life." According to Armstrong, while there are several obstacles to treating others with true compassion, there is none larger than our own egotism and how it clouds our vision and narrows our understanding of others. The 12 steps in her book are intended to help us step outside of ourselves and thus enable us to be more compassionate with one another. I will go into detail on each step in a moment, and some I go into more detail than others. I should add that I think the steps get progressively more difficult as they go along. But briefly, here's the list of the 12 steps. First step is learn about compassion. Second step, look at your own world. Step 3, compassion for yourself. Step 4, empathy. Step 5, mindfulness. Step 6, action. Step 7, how little we know. Step 8, how should we speak to one another? Step 9, concern for everybody. Step 10, knowledge. Step 11, recognition. And step 12, love your enemies. So I will begin with step 1, which is titled, Learn About Compassion. It's pretty obvious that in order to live and cultivate a certain quality, like compassion, that we must first understand what that quality means. Armstrong says that most often people confuse compassion with pity. But this is not true compassion in her eyes. When we pity another person, we remain separate from and often above them. We may bemoan their fate, but we do not necessarily enter into an equal relationship with them. Instead, Armstrong states that compassion means to endure something with another person, to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, to feel her pain as though it were our own, and to enter generously into his point of view. This is why compassion is aptly summed up in the Golden Rule, which asks us to look into our own hearts, discover what gives us pain, and then refuse, under any circumstances whatsoever, to inflict that pain on anybody else. Compassion can be defined, therefore, as an attitude of principled, consistent altruism. Armstrong goes into great detail in her book about how some version of the Golden Rule exists in all the major world religions. I'm not going to go into the details here because we're going to have the opportunity you'll have the opportunity in the next few months to hear from religious and spiritual leaders from themselves. Excuse me. Armstrong has her critics on this topic of the Golden Rule in the world's religions. One such critic is the religious scholar Stephen Prothero. In his book, God is Not One, he argues that insisting on the commonalities of the world's religions by way of the Golden Rule is like saying that all the world religions are effectively the same. Prothero points out that while the Golden Rule may make an appearance in all the major religions, it is more central to some religions than to others. And I think Prothero makes a good point to remind us to be careful not to boil down any religious tradition to a single concept, even one as inviting as compassion. To oversimplify a religious or philosophical tradition is to forget all the singular things that make it what it is. But to Armstrong's credit, as a longtime religious scholar herself, I do not think that she is proposing that all religious traditions are the same at all. But I do think her focus and goal is completely different from that of Prothero. Armstrong is not so much interested, in this book at least, in explaining she's not so much interested in this book in explaining or telling the story of religion. She is interested above all in understanding the role compassion plays in the world's religions and how we can cultivate it in our own religious or ethical practice. Step 2 is titled, Look at Your Own Role. In this step, Armstrong asks that we take ourselves mentally to the summit of a high mountain, where we can stand back and see things from a different perspective. She proposes that we begin with our family and move outward in concentric circles to our friends, and then our community at large, and finally to the country in which we live. During this step, We should observe the ways in which we behave with compassion and the barriers that stand in the way of us being more compassionate. And think about what we could do about that. Armstrong says, many of the things that we have long taken for granted, our financial institutions, our political parties, seem suddenly inadequate. We are unable to deal with the massive problems of hunger and poverty. We know that our environmental policies are unsustainable, and yet we cannot seem to find a viable way of dealing with them. But we should not approach our task with the harsh zeal of a reformer. There should be no anger, frustration, or impatience in our survey. We must look at our community with compassion, estimate its strengths as well as its weaknesses, and assess its potential for change. In step 3, Armstrong encouraged us to have compassion for ourselves. The idea here is simple. If we cannot love ourselves or have compassion for ourselves, then we will not be able to love another or have compassion for another. Moreover, Armstrong says, during this step, make a conscious effort to look back on the events that have caused you distress in the past. Make a deliberate effort to inhabit those moments fully and send a message of encouragement and sympathy to your former self. The object of this exercise is not to leave you wallowing in self-pity, but by remembering your own sorrow vividly, you will make it possible for yourself to feel empathy with others. And this leads to the 4th step, which is titled empathy. In this step, Armstrong gives us a meditation to practice. In the meditation, we are to bring to mind 3 specific people in our lives. One person we have no strong feelings for one way or another. One person who we like, such as a family member or a friend. And one person we dislike. And as we think about each person in turn, she instructs us to think of their good points, their contribution to your own life, their generosity, courage, and sense of humor. You will then desire them to be free of their pain and resolve to help them in any way you can. Wish for each of your 3 people the joy that you desire for yourself, and finally admit that you all have faults. Yourself, the person you feel neutral toward, the one you like, as well as the one you find objectionable. Armstrong goes on to say that we should observe how much more difficult it is for us to extend our thoughts of compassion towards the person we dislike. And she says this is an important lesson in this step, for it shows us how limited our compassion is, and how so much of our goodwill is dependent on our own subjective likes and dislikes. Step 5 is called mindfulness. And in this step, Armstrong asks us to incorporate into our daily lives a practice of being aware of and observing how we behave towards others. What are the impulses or ideas that cause us to behave the way we do? And how our own behavior and the behavior of others makes us feel during our interactions with them. She says that as we practice this meditation of mindfulness, we will notice how the moments when we do not treat others with compassion arise in response to stimuli that would make us irrationally angry, hostile, greedy, lustful, or frightened. But the more we practice and observe, the more aware we will become of how unhappy these primitive emotions make us feel. She states that once we know the cause of so much human pain is within ourselves, we have the motivation to change. We will find that we are happier when we are peaceful than when we are angry or restless, and that, like the Buddha, we can make the effort to cultivate these positive emotions. Noticing, for example, that when we perform an act of kindness, we ourselves feel better. Of course, mindfulness is not an end in itself, and leads naturally into the 6th step, which is action. In this step, Armstrong asks us to start doing 3 things on a daily basis. First, she instructs us to make a resolution to act once every day in accordance with the positive version of the Golden Rule, which the positive version is treat others as you wish to be treated. She says this daily act of kindness does not have to be a grand gesture. It could be as simple as calling an elderly relative or taking time to listen to a colleague or friend who is anxious and depressed. Second, she asks us to make a similar resolution to fulfill every day the negative version of the golden rule, which is do not do to others what you would not like them to do to you. For example, she says, try to catch yourself before making a brilliantly wounding remark, asking yourself how you would like to be on the receiving end of such sarcasm. And in the third part of this step, she asks us to change our negative thought patterns, whether it be self-pity or resentment or maybe not feeling thankful for what we have. In the seventh step, titled How Little We Know, Armstrong wants us to do three things. The first is to recognize and appreciate the unknown and the unknowable, to become sensitive to overconfident assertions of certainty in ourselves and other people, and three, to make ourselves aware of the numinous mystery of each human being we encounter during the day. The goal of this step is to help us remain open-minded about other individuals and cultures. After all, if we think we already know it all, then how can we effectively make room for another person? If we are to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, as Atticus Finch says in To Kill a Mockingbird, we must first be mindful that there are things we do not know about that person, their past, or their culture. Step 8 is titled, How Should We Speak to One Another? In this step, Armstrong discusses the harsh and aggressive way that issues are discussed in today's world. She says, the debates in our parliamentary institutions, the media, academia, and the law courts are essentially competitive. It is not enough for us to seek the truth. We also want to defeat and even humiliate our opponents. She asks us that during this step, that we as individuals are mindful of the way we speak to others. And as you enter into a dialogue with others, she asks that you keep in mind the following questions. When you argue, do you get carried away by your own cleverness and deliberately inflict pain on your opponent? Do you get personal? Will the points you make further the cause of understanding, or are they exacerbating an already inflammatory situation? Are you really listening to your opponent? What would happen if, while debating a trivial matter that would have no serious consequences, you allowed yourself to lose the argument? After contentious discussion, Armstrong asks us to conduct a post-mortem of ourselves by asking the following questions. Can you really back up everything you said in the heat of the moment? Did you want to inflict pain? Did you really know and what you were talking about? Or were you depending on hearsay? And before you embark on an argument or debate, ask yourself honestly if you are ready to change your mind. Step 9 is titled, Concern for Everybody. The purpose of this step is to work towards a principled and practically oriented acknowledgement of the absolute equality of all human beings. In the second step, Armstrong had us work outward from our family circle to our friends and community, and outward still to our country. And in this step, she asked that we extend what we have learned in previous steps and apply it to the wider global community. During this step, she asks us to be mindful of the way we talk about foreigners, other cultures. She asks us to recall the seventh step, how little we know, when we talk about or encounter people from other cultures or nations. She says we should challenge our own certainty that we really know very much at all about their culture. If you find yourself criticizing another country's stance or actions, remember that your own country may be guilty of the same actions or worse. And as we attempt to abandon these kind of tribalistic or nationalistic outlooks in cultivating this concern for everybody, we arrive at step 10, which is titled Knowledge. Armstrong asks us in the first step to become more knowledgeable about our own, in this step, to become more knowledgeable about our own nation and religious tradition. Are there behaviors that our tradition has been guilty of that we deride in other traditions or nations or cultures? Then she asks us to focus our energy on learning about one or two of our global neighbors, whether it be a nation or a culture, trying to understand their history. We should try to find ways to experience their culture periodically, either through books or movies or articles. And what can we learn from this? She says that what we will learn from this experience is that everything is much more complex than we previously thought. By carefully practicing the previous steps, she hopes that you will arrive at the 11th step, which is recognition. When we reach this recognition stage, Armstrong says that our work in the previous steps will reveal that we are not alone in our suffering, but that everybody is in pain. And more importantly, she goes on to say that at this step, we have allowed our own unhappiness and the sorrow of other people to invade our consciousness. We have learned that we cannot put ourselves in a special, separate category. And finally, I believe this is the most difficult step, which is the 12th step. Love your enemies. In this step, Armstrong asks us to take everything we have learned from the previous steps. And perhaps if you have gone through the previous 11 steps in earnest, this last step is not as difficult as it sounds. When you take your ego out of the equation, when you can recognize that all human beings suffer and enter into suffering with them, when you can remind yourself that there are things you cannot know for certain about an individual or their culture, when we learn to speak to others with more compassion, then perhaps making a place for your enemy is not so hard after all. Perhaps if you practice the first 11 steps faithfully, perhaps the concept of enemy itself becomes obsolete in the way you live your life. In reflecting upon Karen Armstrong's ideas on compassion and planning this Compassion at Westside series, I have many hopes. First, I hope you have found Armstrong's ideas as compelling as I have. What I have found to be most important and profound about them is that she provides a practical roadmap for compassion. Moreover, her 12 steps to a compassionate life also serve as a guide to living our Unitarian Universalist principles. Second, I hope that what I have shared with you this morning lays a foundation and sets the tone for the series of spiritual and intellectual leaders who will be standing in this pulpit in the next few months, sharing with you the meaning and practices of compassion in their religion or philosophy. And finally, I hope you find our Compassion at Westside series to be a worthwhile and meaningful experience in the coming months. As we rise and by your Spirit, would you please join in singing the closing hymn, number 299, Make Channels for Streams of Love.